Ska vara för 5 minuter sedan, men de gick vilse allihopa hela tiden. Varsågod, slå sig ner. Okej allihopa. Vi får börja settle down. Jag känner mig just nu väldigt trygg för vår tredje paneldeltagare kom precis infarande genom dörren och det känns ju jättebra. Åtminstone innan seminariet börjar. Innan vi kickar igång så ska jag bara berätta att det här sänds live på nätet. Det är en av anledningarna till att vi är så sjukt punktliga, vilket vi inte brukar vara annars. Det betyder också att när vi sen ställer frågor till panelen och när interaktionen kommer igång här och ni börjar retweeta live här inne och så vidare, så måste vi göra det i micken. Så att se till att vänta in micken så att vi får med oss den här sändningen på ett bra sätt. Då kickar vi igång och jag tror jag vågar påstå att det här faktiskt är den allra coolaste och bästa sessionen på de här 2 dagarna som vi håller till här. Så att brace yourself. Temat är från tryckeri till API och eftersom vi ska köra det här på engelska så gick jag ut på Twitter och bad om hjälp att översätta. So from now on we're going to do this in English instead. So these were the suggestions we received. I mean, Twitter is an amazing... I mean, Google Translate, they can throw themselves into the wall. They have nothing against Twitter. I find some really funny examples here, don't you, Chris? You agree with them? Yeah, it's good. From ink to link, from press to rest. There is something for every geek in here, I think. So, basically... I was in London 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think, and I saw Chris Thorpe, our main program point today, make an excellent presentation about what The Guardian is doing in Britain. And I'm going to leave that over to him, but basically this is the tagline that I just love. It's not about using the internet, it's not about monetizing the internet, it's actually about full Monty being a part of the internet, and that's an amazing view to have for an old media company. And if this is what we used to have, I mean, this is the old distribution chain. We had the reporter, we had the printing press, and then we had the reader. Things are changing rapidly. And we're going to, of course, take some time on this as well, mainly in the panel afterwards. But if this was the old way of doing things, I would say this is the new way of doing things. There is still someone producing some content. It's thrown into this amazing machine called an API, where some hacker picks it up and do some new amazing stuff with it. And he releases that so some other guys can continue to build on it. And the good thing about the API is that it's thrown out, the content is thrown out to the wild and everyone can do something about it. And that's scary for some of the old media companies. They might think it's a conspiracy. They might think that we are losing control, we're losing everything. But really what I hope Chris is going to be able to explain to us that it's basically a pretty simple steps. It's not such a scary thing after all. So here's the setup for today. I'm not going to bother you anymore. Chris is going to start us off. And then Charlotta Friborg from Dejan is going to give us some reflections on what Chris has said. Bo Hedin is going to continue, and Morris Packer from TV4 Expressen is going to finish up the first round. And when that is done, we're all sitting here, and then it's time for some kind of discussion about this. I'm going to give you every chance to ask every question you've ever wanted to ask about the API. So without further ado, Chris, we're going to switch over to you.
Cool. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you for the introduction. And also thank you for misspelling the word Guardian on the slide there, because actually there's a long-standing English joke about the fact that the Guardian can't spell. And the reason is that it used to be printed in Manchester, and it would then come down on the train to London. And so by the time it hit London, there was no chance of actually correcting the typos that normally newspapers actually correct at the start. And so it became known as the Groniad, and it's pretty much known as that by all of the UK industry. Thank you so much for having me here. It's a real honour. I have to say that this is actually the only Swedish you'll see in this talk, and for that I really do apologise. If I attempted to speak Swedish, it would be an unmitigated disaster. So we'll stick to this, from the printing press to the API. This is the view from within the Guardian's really lovely new headquarters in London. And whilst it's nice to be in a really modern building, it's also nice to think about the past, and it's especially pertinent here. And this is actually, we have a large facsimile reproduction of the first edition of the Manchester Guardian, pride of place in one of the stairwells. And it's lovely to go and look at, because actually it reminds you that nothing much has really changed. We have stories about bankruptcy. It's pretty topical. We have adverts. Admittedly, we sell less adverts now for people who've got ruptures. We sell less surgical truss adverts than we used to. And it has a price, and admittedly the price has increased. So as we move from delivering things from a printing press to the clouds and wires, what's actually changed? And slightly more importantly, what needs to change? I think it's totally out in the open that mass media, and in particular the newspaper industry, is undergoing huge structural change at the moment. And what we have to do is just sort of try and introspect all of our business models, all of our procedures, and actually reinvent them. It's almost like being a startup to actually sort of see how we exist in this world. So let's look at the newspaper as it is and as it was. So it's very much a product of the industrial age. And the industrial age can be typified by these words: creation, fabrication, distribution, and monetization. So let's look at creation of physical newspapers. This is the newsroom for the Miami Herald in the 1950s. And if you look at pictures of newsrooms at the turn of the 20th century, they're virtually no different. Nothing's really changed. This is one of the sort of fairly recent offset presses, but actually it's a direct line descendant of the original printing press. It just does it faster, it does it with colour, it puts things together. We still distribute to news outlets, and we still have those news outlets then distribute on to the end customers. Nothing's changed there. Occasionally we can brand that distribution network, more often than not we don't. There are local drop-off points in some cultures where you can buy the newspaper. And everywhere there's a hyper-local drop-off point, whether it's your drive or through your door. And we still have a cover price. So actually nothing's really changed from that first edition. And if we look at the way we produce the current website, it still looks pretty similar. So this is our current newsroom in our new building. Apart from the fact that there are lots of Macintoshes there, it's pretty much the same as the Miami Herald's newsroom, even in terms of how people sit laid out around their desks. We have an offset press. We just call it a content management system. It can print vast numbers of editions every day, but it's still essentially an offset press. We have a distribution network, a collection of our own sites and affiliate sites that hand out the content. And actually, where we used to have hyper-local distribution of a physical newspaper, you now carry it with you. It's on your phone. So it's pretty much the same. And we still monetize it with adverts. The Guardian isn't, for the foreseeable future, and it's pretty much for the ever, going to put up a paywall. We don't think that's the way to go. I'll explain a bit more why later. So we don't see that we're going to charge a cover price for online. But there is this massive disruption going on, and it's not just to do with the economic climate at the moment, which lots of people are blaming it on, and it's not to do with the fact that the bottom's fallen out of advertising. It's to do with the very nature of the internet and the changes in user behaviours when you go from print to online. Print is pretty much fine. It's a declining market, but it has none of the structural problems. In fact, it's got some advantages. You know, if somebody decides to do the crossword in the print edition, no load on my server for that. That's fantastic. So people are writing some really intelligent stuff, and I encourage you all to go and read this if you haven't already, the Internet Manifesto, talking about how journalism works today in the online world. And people are also talking about this really dystopian future that James Boyle hinted at, of what happens if you don't have newspapers. And the answer for lots of people is you have a new era of corruption. You have companies and governments that no longer have the checks and balances of an independent media on them. And lots of people, excuse me, are thinking about what will save the newspapers. Joanne Geary is a really good sort of Twitterer about this. She works for the London Times. And she's not suggesting that any of these are good ideas. But it's the thing that all through the industry they're saying will save newspapers. We're going to add some video. We're going to add some search engine optimization. We're going to add some real-time media. These are all very much mass media push solutions to the problem. And the problem is actually bidirectionality. The fact that the readers, the users, are themselves creating, they're curating, they're linking, they're sharing. It's no longer an organization that can push outwards a lot of the time. So what can you do to sort of solve this problem? Well, one solution is to try and ignore it and hope it goes away. But I think we all know that's not really going to happen. The other one is to try and control it. And we've seen the music industry do this for years, none of it very satisfactorily. And the other is to try and embrace the problem. Actually, so what's causing this? And actually, how can we be part of it? And we have a word for this, and that word's a slightly long one. But this is, we can blame our editor for that. You can tell a technologist didn't write the word that we suggest for this. And it's to do with how we think we're going to be going forward. And it comes from a talk that Alan Rusbridger gave about creating a mutualized newspaper. A newspaper where the relationship between journalists and readers is much more two-way than it currently is. One of the great things about being at a newspaper is that we have cartoonists. So you get cartoons for your slide decks, which is really great. And this is Andre Krause imagining a current 20th century newspaper with all of the journalists sitting inside that big wall, throwing their content over the wall, not knowing whether they've actually hit some of the people with it or not. And what we see going forward is actually this, where there's not just transparency between reader and journalist, there's actually this sort of hole that you can reach through, where the journalists and the readers can, touch each other and make an effect on each other. And we talk a lot about how do we lower the walls between journalists and readers all the time. I always like definitions, and I tried to find a really good definition for mutualism that didn't involve banks or building societies. It's kind of hard. But I like this one from Wikipedia, and it's talking about an anarchist school of thought, which immediately I like the idea of. But the bit that I really love in this is the fact that this sort of writer envisioned a society where each person might possess a means of production, either individually or collectively. And that really reminds me of YouTube and Flickr and Wikipedia and all the other things we've come to associate with this sort of movement that everyone calls Web 2. So it strikes me we're on the right sort of track. And let's try and just pull apart these words and see what happens when you mutualize them. So this becomes co-creation. We've got some good examples of where this is happening journalistically. We had the G20 process in London last year, and it was actually one of the most photographed protests in the history of mankind, one of the most photographed events. These are all press photographers queuing up to watch somebody hurl a TV through a window, who, strangely, he doesn't seem to have covered his face, so that's a bit of a fail. But more interestingly was the number of cameras that are actually within the protesters themselves. Vast numbers of people have video cameras, they have stills cameras, they have their mobile phones. And in fact, this guy, Rue Reynolds, who works for the BBC, who was going between meetings, and he ended up being trapped by the police in one of these areas where they kettled people. And he took loads of pictures, and they're all pictures that would be quite happily to be on the front page of a newspaper. They're fantastic pictures. But then things sadly took a turn for the worst, and a protester died. And one of our journalists there, Paul Lewis, felt that this tragic death was somewhat suspicious, that the story didn't quite match that was being put out. So through the newspaper, through his articles in print and his articles online and his Twitter feed, he started saying, does anybody have any photos of this man falling over? Because everyone just thought he was drunk and he just fell over. And it turns out an American tourist did. I don't have the video here, but it's online and it's now in the UK quite iconic. This American tourist found that he had a piece of video of this man being struck by a policeman and falling to his death. And it completely changed that story. It went from being something not quite right to being, and here's the evidence to do it. And we could never have done that without that reader. It's really important how it starts to change things dramatically when you get all of these means of creation out there. Looking at both creation and distribution together, we've got another example, which is very recent. In fact, it's from earlier this month. Does anybody know what this word means here? One person, fantastic. Two, superb. So Trafigura is they're an oil company, to all intents and purposes. But they also are responsible for dumping some pretty appalling toxic waste in the Ivory Coast, causing lots of illness and actually some deaths. And they've been trying to cover up a report which they had commissioned into the effects of this. And what happened next was that they actually put what's known as a super injunction on the Guardian. And some of these slides were created when this super injunction was still in place, but I thought it was worth leaving them there. So what a super injunction is it's when you're not allowed to report something, but you're not allowed to report that you can't report something. So there's an extra layer of covering things up. And we sought legal advice. This is our editor, Alan Rusbridger, as to what he could say. And the answer was not very much. It was just that we're prevented from reporting Parliament, was about all we could say. And this is the news article. And the news article actually goes on to about there. So it's not very long, because there wasn't a lot we could say about what was going on. What happened very quickly, though, was that people picked it up on Twitter and started telling each other about it. Because people were pretty incensed that Parliament and parliamentary reporting was being gagged by a company. It's never happened before in the UK that you cannot report on Parliament. And they started to have a little dig around, because after all, lots of our readers are internet savvy, and certainly the ones who are on Twitter are. And they realised that actually it was to do with questions being asked in Parliament. And Parliament has a website. Who'd have known? And it's actually got the question on. We couldn't, when we first gave this talk, show you question 63, which was down the bottom. Because if I'd have shown you it, I'd have been breaking the injunction. And what the people who put this injunction in place had forgotten something really fundamental, which Tom Coates from Yahoo says really well, which is that we live in the age of point at things. And our readers could just point at what they found. Everyone could be an investigator, and actually everyone was their own broadcast network in it. And it spread out and it amplified. To a point where actually 13 hours later, the word that we couldn't say at that point, which was trafigura, and the word Guardian were actually in the trending terms. So we didn't need to say it anymore. Wired then said this: awesome to be watching media history being made in real time as shown. Censorship is futile. And just as a colleague of mine was giving a talk about some of this, we were allowed to talk about it. For me, the fascinating thing was looking at the trending map. So imagine you're in the space station, and you're looking down at the world, and you're looking at sentiment rather than geography. This is what you would have seen in the UK on that morning. You would have seen a few names. So Stephen Fry, I think lots of us know. Charlton Brooker is one of our columnists who's very funny. Doesn't normally talk about politics, normally talks about the media. Alan Rusbridge is our editor. But the main words were Guardian, gagging, dumping for toxic waste and things like that. They no longer have the ability to gag the media. And it's really fascinating. It's been such a test case that individually people don't have much power in terms of taking on large corporations. That's sort of why they need newspapers, because newspapers can shine a light and be gagged and can take a lot of legal costs that you couldn't do as an individual. That's why things like WikiLeaks are important. But what media organisations can do is they can say, over there's something interesting. Go and look. And so it's why, in my opinion, they need to remain. And that's not just because I work at The Guardian. So let's have a look at some of the API stuff. So we think that co-fabrication and co-distribution go together. And we have a project for this, and it's called Open Platform. It's the project I work on most of the time there. And it's so you can build applications with The Guardian. We've thought about those words really carefully, and part of that will come later. So there are two parts to the API. There's a content API, which is about 1 million articles in XML, JSON, and Atom, for those of you who are geeky, which date back to about 1991. And they're all the things that we have rights for. And that rights thing from this morning comes back. We can't actually give out certain things on the API because we don't have the relevant rights for them. But everything that we're commissioning now, we do. We also have a thing called the data store, which is beautifully curated data sets. So the data sets that we generate, which we'll put a stamp of approval on. So again, anyone who was at James's talk earlier will know the importance of things that you can sort of stamp and say this is authentic or this is from an organisation. And this was the phrase you heard at the start, this intention of weaving The Guardian into the fabric of the internet. And I was sitting next to a friend of mine who's also an O'Reilly author. He's just published a book on social software called Gavin Bell. And he said, into, not on, cool. And I think, you know, we heard earlier about why this is important. We want this to be a very, very long-term thing for The Guardian. One of the things that we were talking about when we were first thinking about this project was, if we can give our stuff to people so that they love us even more and they build it into their things, then if ever for some reason we cease to exist, there'd be such a howl of sadness that actually would be almost unbearable for the internet. And so that was sort of one of the things to think about to do with into, that you need to be so enmeshed within it. If we'd done on, nobody would really cared. They're borrowing stuff from us. They're not really part of us. Another person who said something important on the day we launched is this gentleman. He's one of the members of Parliament, and at the time he was responsible for a very important document called the Power of Information Task Force, which was to do with how governments opened up. And he felt that we'd sort of led the way with lots of this stuff. And I particularly like the question is, how long will it take us to catch up? We now then know the answer to that, which is about 6 months. So the UK government has just released a massive amount of data, 1,000 data sets. And it's wonderful that they've done that, and some really great things are coming from it. Another example of weaving in was actually the government asked us to convene a whole group of developers who'd worked with our API, worked with our data, to see what they could make out of government data. And so this is a group of people that we brought into The Guardian. We were very lucky, Sir Tim Berners-Lee was in the country at the time, so he came in and gave a really inspirational speech about how he hoped that government data would be used. And people started making things. So these are two people furiously coding. And what they started to make was really, really interesting. This is a newspaper that they made out of government data that's centered around your individual location. So the idea is it would be a welcome present for when you turned up in a neighbourhood. This is another one. It's to do with improving how you find primary schools in the UK. At the moment it's really hard because you have to go forward and backward and forward and backward from a site which tells you how good the school is. And you normally have to do it, going through the process at the moment with my wife, with a paper and pencil next to your computer. I mean, how retarded is that in the day of data that you have to sit there scribbling furiously about what it is that you want as criteria? Other people looked at data to do with transport, to do with looking to see if transport patterns had changed since congestion zones came in. Really exciting things that can be made by data. It's another reason why I'm showing you some of this, which is to do with following up from something that James said earlier about innovation blockage to do with rights. All of those examples I showed you, and this wasn't me just picking them, relate to geography. Because we live and exist in a place and a time. And at the moment in the UK, our access to data about places is completely restricted by two organisations, both of which are semi-government owned. One is the Royal Mail, and the other is the Ordnance Survey. And so, following on from what James said, it's really important to break these barriers about individual pieces of government infrastructure, because without knowing a way to look up a place, you can't actually build user-centric services around data. Incredibly important. But let's think about a shinier world. This was my boarding pass when I flew out yesterday, and I just loved the fact that it said API OK. It was almost like somebody was monitoring where I was going and was telling me it was all right. But I just love it when this data that we're talking about becomes like electricity. That would just be a fabulous day. And one of the reasons why I want to talk about this is that it's not just about The Guardian having an API. It actually gets really, really interesting when other people do as well, when there's government data, when every newspaper has one. Because then you can start looking at biases, and you can start looking at history from multiple perspectives. And it means that you also have to teach children about data literacy, which is pretty important anyway. So coming back to publishers, Jeff Jarvis said this recently. So the media brand is less a destination and a magnet to draw people there than a label once you've found content, wherever and however you found it. And this is something we believe really deeply to do with the Content API. So the Content API is a search-backed API. So it's essentially the same as our search engine. It's got the full article content for everything we have rights. That means you get every single word that's in the article. And there's also a journalist-curated set of tags. And what this allows you to do is to build a combination of search words and a tag, empowering a website for niches. We think that niches, sort of thin verticals like art or sport, or even just a smaller one like football, or even a smaller one like your local football team, are really important for several reasons. One, they're far easier to monetize. People know something about the people who visit those sites, and all of the adverts that you can place there are ones that are likely to get clicked on, for starters, and have a higher value. So we think they're more monetizable than major tracts of content. Let me give you an example of something that was made. So this is a website for a small art foundation. Anthony Gormley is a fairly well-known British artist. And this organisation has, mood lighting, great, has always sort of tried to do things technologically. So when we had the API at The Guardian, we reached out to them, and I know them pretty well, said, do you want news? Because I knew that they'd always wanted to do news. And we actually put news onto the artist pages in about 3 hours in total with a brand new API. It's really, really simple to do. And now every artist page gets the latest news from The Guardian the moment it's there. So it's sort of a 13-year-long wish from this arts organisation suddenly got fulfilled. And it got fulfilled by a very simple query, which was, give me anything that's Anthony Gormley in the section art and design. And that's as simple as it gets, and that's as complex as it has to be. So anyone who sort of tells you that you have to write really deep, rich APIs isn't understanding the fact that the people who build on them initially want to build something simple and something quick. And that, whereas there are some things that you do in life that will instantly net you lots of money, integrating news into your site maybe won't get you lots of money immediately. From a newspaper's perspective, they want scale. They want lots and lots of people to do it. That's how to get money for them in the end. But as a developer, you have to do things very quickly. The interesting thing is what The Guardian gets out of this relationship. So it's clear that the art website gets news. What's The Guardian get? Well, the answer is that this art website has got much bigger traffic in Japan and America to do with the arts than The Guardian has. It's quite ironic, really tiny art website. So instantly we now get all of their viewers. And that leads back to The Guardian website and exposes The Guardian to a new audience, which is sort of something that I think any publisher would want to do. And it's a cheap way of doing it because somebody else does it for you. Another example is to do with the ecology section. So there's a site called EcoDNA who are using Guardian content to annotate their own content to do with living an ecologically friendly lifestyle. And they're starting to participate in a green advertising network that we've set up, where we're actually offering green services from ecologically sensitive companies. And so you can start to see that the tighter you can bind together content and intent and adverts, the better it's going to be for everyone. It's not all about advertising, though. The gentleman on the right of this picture is a better developer than the gentleman on the left. So this is Alberto Nardelli, and he runs a service called Tweetminster. And Tweetminster pulls together Twitter messages of MPs, parliamentary candidates, different political parties, Parliament itself, and number 10, the Prime Minister's sort of personal Twitter stream. And they then do some interesting stuff with it. So what you can do is you can search it for terms. And you can say, I want to find everything in here about the BBC. And it will then tell you when these terms are popular. It's kind of a Sparkline analytics graph. And what they've now done is you can click on each of those points and it'll go and search The Guardian, and it will tell you what news stories were pertinent for that particular search term on that particular day. And so we can see in this case, it's all about bonuses and expenses. So clearly the MPs were delighted that the BBC were having equal problems with expenses and being watched as they were. And we're talking about it quite a lot. We're seeing people build mobile apps. It's a really lovely one, which is actually the best and the most downloaded mobile app in the Android store for news. We didn't have to build it. A company called Future Platforms built it. And so it extends the reach instantly. We're finding that we're getting so many apps built that we've had to actually create an app gallery now so that we can surface them. These aren't apps that you can buy, but we feel that having an app store is kind of important so that people can browse through them, see what's being made. In terms of the data that we give out, we've had a lot of data for a long while. In England, this is a really well-known infographic. It's to do with government spending in different departments. And for a long while, The Guardian's been known as the source of the best data on this, to such an extent that we get a yearly request for a big version of this for Downing Street. because it's actually better than they had themselves. Because a lot of work goes into curating it. But actually now what we do is we give this data away. You can go to our data blog, you can go to the Google spreadsheet that's linked to it, and you can get the data. You can do your own visualization. And the interesting thing is, we can't in a flat infographic show year-on-year trends so easily. We'd have to do some form of interactive, which we do now. But actually you don't have to rely on us doing the interactive. You can go and take these figures, do it yourself. You could actually compare UK government spending with Swedish government spending if they release the data as well. So you can do some kind of interesting stuff. We have a really good visualization artist that's part of our developer community called David McCandless. And he runs a blog called Information is Beautiful. And I love this. It's very flippant, but it's kind of fun. So he's taken the Guardian data on the largest percentage of populations using illegal drugs. And then he's found another index from the Netherlands about happiness. And he's then compared where they match up. And he's actually, it's 42% correlation, so that's actually not that good. But it shows what you can start doing when you start mixing data sources up. Another interesting data source that was leaked was the BNP membership list. So the BNP is the British Nationalist Party. And when it was leaked, lots of people straight away did a Google Maps mashup of it, which we think is really dangerous because UK postcodes cover about 50 houses. So your neighbour down the road could be a BNP member, but the map pin would end up over your head. So we took it and turned it into something to do with parliamentary constituencies. So we wanted to sort of abstract the data out a bit, but still show which areas had high amounts of BNP. Amusingly, they lost their membership list again this year. So we were able to show areas that increased and decreased. And if you want to go and do the analysis, all of the data on which constituencies have increases and decreases are there on the data blog. And one of the things that the BNP actually say a lot is that they have membership in areas surrounding areas of extreme ethnic diversity. So David McCandless again grabbed our data from the data blog, which is derived from the BNP list. He then got the National Office of Statistics data, which says where there are areas of high ethnic diversity. And he then saw where the matches were. And what you see is that the BNP has very large areas of blue, which is their membership, in areas that are nowhere near ethnic diversity. So you can start to use data to completely blow apart fatuous arguments like that. And things are starting to happen which are really interesting. So this is on the blog post on Flickr, where David talks about this visualization. And you can see people are starting to have a discussion about what the data means. And that's one of the things we wanted to do when we released the data, was to start enabling discussions about data itself and about statistics. And if you want to go and see some of the visualizations, there's a Flickr group. So just search for Guardian Data Store. This is just a couple of recent examples. So the school stuff is, again, kind of interesting. So this would annotate nicely that government data mashup I showed earlier. In the UK, you have to apply for school places for your children. So you could actually show on that map that I showed earlier, not only how good the school was, but what your chances were of getting an appeal against your child getting a place. And this is my favourite one from today. We're bailing the British banks out again to the tune of 38 billion. And apparently you get 4 Olympic Games for 38 billion. So I really hope the banks are going to be good, because I'd far rather have 4 Olympic Games. 633 attack helicopters. That sounds like a much better deal than 3 rather dodgy banks. So if we're going to monetize this whole stack, we're going to make this whole stack mutual. The bit that's remaining is monetization. And how are we going to do that? Well, we have a plan to co-monetize. We have several. The first one is the traditional one, which is advertising. Ad networks are truly phenomenally huge. So Platform A, which is AOL's ad network, if you looked at it in the US, it's 176 million unique visitors, which is an enormous amount of visitors. And we don't think we can ever compete with any on that list, but what we can do is we can package up an ad network for a little microcosm of content, along with the content itself, and then we share the revenue with the people who make things out of that combination of content and advertising. But one of our reasons for doing this whole project is that no matter how many bright people we can get into the building in King's Place, there are going to be statistically far more outside of the building. And so essentially what we're kind of doing is crowdsourcing new business models. We're saying, here's our content, what can you make out of it, and how could you sell it, and how could you package it, and how could you make money out of it? And if you can do that, then come back and tell us, and we'll share. And we think that that's the way that we'll find some really, really interesting business models. Because none of us would have guessed that idea about looking at all of the MP's tweets, pulling them together, and then using The Guardian as context on top of it. And they're going to sell that as a service to people who want to actually look at what's going on inside Parliament. So some really interesting monetisation opportunities going on. I wanted to talk a tiny bit about fabrication. We're working on a project that's going to launch in about January, so I can't talk entirely about it, but we're kind of interested in how we use our APIs and the Guardian website and lots of things out there in the cloud to make things quicker for the Guardian. And I'll give you some examples about why we need to do this, and it's all to do with cost saving. So it's the fact that in the sort of newspaper industry, there are some things that actually have different speeds and different needs than others. And I'll give you some examples. So there are sporting events, and then there are major world events. There are things that you can sort of plan for, like elections and budgets. And then there are cultural events. And they all have very similar capabilities, or very similar profiles. They all have really high load. They have high interactivity or high requirement for interactivity. People want to play with lots of gadgets when they go to these sorts of sites. Their load is very temporary, so you see a massive spike of traffic and then it dips off dramatically. But you need to make sure that you archive them, or else actually the internet's broken. You know, this whole idea that Sir Tim Berners-Lee had years ago about cool links are ones that don't die. We can't make something temporary and then just sort of say, oh, well, never mind, that doesn't exist anymore. There are also things where people distribute them socially and where they want to be social on them. And we're seeing a lot to do with social distribution at the moment, either through Facebook or through Twitter. We're doing everything we can to enable it. But what you do get if you enable it is you get these really interesting sort of, it's like watching birds flock or migrate to certain places around your site. Once some people find it and they tell other people and other people and other people, suddenly you get this mad rush of traffic to specific areas of your site. So you have to be mindful of that when you're building things. And how would you solve these normally? We'd either add features to whatever your website ran on, but that would take time and it might be costly. You could buy many more servers to cope with this massive spike in load that you get. But actually that's sort of both fiscally, you know, from a money standpoint it's wrong, and from an environmental standpoint it's wrong too. Because those servers would be sitting in the data center most of the time, doing nothing but consuming electricity. And you could build some really complex layers to try and cache things. We think actually there's a different way, which is to understand that sometimes you need to find the right tool for the right job. And to me, content management systems are a bit like container ships. They do one thing really, really well, which is they transport these things that are all the same shape and size, and they deliver them perfectly. But actually sometimes what you need is this. You need a speedboat. You need something that you can deploy really, really quickly, and it will take a really odd-shaped package. And for those of you who like your British television, there's a model for this, which is the Thunderbirds, who have all sorts of different things that they can deploy in all sorts of different ways and situations to do a job. And we think that's what we have to do. And as we like to say with this, sometimes you have to exceed the speed limit. Now, if you show this picture in England, everyone starts laughing immediately. This is the Stockholm Duck Island, which one British MP decided to claim for as an expense. How you do that, I don't know. How do you sort of say, oh, well, I need an island for my ducks, so I'll just claim that, and the taxpayers can pay for that. But we know that there's a really big missed opportunity cost if we don't react to news stories like this. And so MP's expenses was our first example of how do you do a sort of rapid reaction force to a news story. So we got lots of these things, and this is actually one of the sort of claims from a British MP. You can't tell which one from here, but it tells you what he claimed for. And we built a little game where you could investigate your MP's expenses. And it had lovely game-like things like a progress bar, tell you how far we were going through the job. And there were league tables, so you could see who's been doing the most annotating of these expenses and what the most reviewed pages were. And We think it's a really important data set, and actually, interestingly enough, it's one that the British government doesn't have themselves. They don't have a line-by-line inventory of everything that's been claimed for. So it's a little game, and you can say, this is a claim or a proof, or I think it's not interesting, or it's really interesting. And the fascinating thing for me is how quickly we did it. So we had a proof of concept on a piece of paper on the 11th of June, and it was launched on the 18th of June. That's pretty quick for a sort of social game on a newspaper that gets about 27 million unique visitors a month. It was built with a week's worth of developer time. We added a designer for 2 days and a systems administrator for a day just to deploy it. We had a bit of a problem, which is that normally it takes a few weeks to buy and install hardware. So we're quite quick at The Guardian at getting stuff into the data center, but we couldn't do it quick enough. So actually we used Amazon EC2 and S3, so we used lots of cloud stuff. And so far it's only cost us £50 to run this app, which is a lot cheaper than buying servers. And it was deployed onto that service 1 week after it started. We're not saying we're perfect. So this is Simon Willison, the developer, who's got a pretty big following on Twitter. He said, we've added a new feature, it's great. You can watch the red bar go as we add more documents. And then a moment later, he's like, please stop refreshing our homepage, our database hurts. So we're not saying we're perfect, we're learning on this one all the time. And I think maybe we got a bit carried away with sort of adding in the fun bits there. But it sort of shows how sometimes you have to react in not a haphazard way, but just in an immediate way, and accept the fact that things might go wrong. Because if you don't, then somebody else might do in the future. We're also looking at how we can reuse some of this sort of code that we rush out as a response to things. And I've been doing some stuff recently to do with Twitter. Until they launched lists last week, which I think is a great feature, it was really hard if you wanted to pull together a collection of people to talk about a specific subject. So we all know that you can look at hashtags. The trouble is that the moment your hashtag starts to trend, then in come all the people who like swearing, in come all the people who like sending you videos of porn, and it's not a very good thing to have on the front page of your website, as the Telegraph in the UK found out. So what we were interested in was how can you bring together lists of journalists and people that we trust and a particular hashtag like this one for the Edinburgh Festival and have a curated Twitter stream. So you can say this is sort of almost using Twitter as a really small content management system. It's multi-author, and people can use their phones and their devices, which they already know and love. And it seems to work quite well. We rolled it out to the Liberal Democrats conference afterwards, because it stood up to Edinburgh. And then we gave it a real kicking at the Labour conference. So this year was make or break year for Gordon Brown, really. He gave an amazing speech, and Michael White, who's a very well-known journalist in the UK, and is about 60, became a Twitter addict pretty much overnight at the Labour Party conference. And he was live tweeting this sort of talk from Gordon Brown. We built this on App Engine rather than EC2 because we wanted to test loads of different things out. It took me 2 days. We added a designer for half a day, and so far it's cost us nothing to host. So instantly you can start to see that by distributing your content far and wide, building new relationships with other people so that they're making things and they're helping to monetize things, and using services like this, where you're taking advantage of this whole free economy that Chris Anderson talks about, you can start really reducing the cost of ownership of an online endeavor for a newspaper. So, where are we going next? Well, it's a journey, and I would be foolish to actually give you an idea of where this is going to end. So I don't think anybody in the newspaper industry or the mass media industry can see more than 2, maybe 3 years ahead at the moment. I think everything is changing that quickly. And so we're just adding new features, and we're talking to people who are using it and saying, what do you want? What can we do for you? How can we help syndicate content to you? What sort of content's missing? What do you want? And we're moving forward. We've only been going since March, and already we have close to 2,000 developers who are making stuff with this. So we think it's got potential. I'd just like to end with a quote from this chap. This is our Director of Technology. And he said this about 1.5 years ago. And this used to be at the start of our slide decks internally when we were talking about this project to people, when we were going around talking to everybody internally and saying, this is what we've got to do, it's what we think we have to do. He says the significant thing is to think about The Guardian as a platform and not as a publisher. And I think it's worth putting it at the end now, because I think we're starting to get towards the stage where for certain sectors of the community, like data people and developers, whilst they probably love the newspaper, we see them really engaging with the data. So I think they're starting to see us as a platform. We're starting to get people coming to us and saying, you know lots of cool developers, like the government did. And that to me is a sign that we're building the right sort of developer network. There's really only one way to end this talk, because it's about being mutual. And that's to say, what would you do? Do people here have a good idea for a business model? Do people here have a good idea for an app? What can you do with this sort of stuff? But I'll give you my contact details so that you can get in touch with me and chat further. But thank you very much for the invite, and it's been lovely being here.
Thank you, Chris. I think we're going to bring the whole panel at once. Would you care to sit down with the panel?
Yes, sure,
Chris?
absolutely. Where should I sit?
And we're going to leave your slide up there so everyone can make sure that they know where to find you. We're going to let the good panelists give us a quick rundown of their opinion and their reactions to what Chris just told us. And then we're going to bring in you, the audience. I'm sure you have a million of questions and maybe even some proposals for Chris on what to do.
Where's the back channel?
The back channel. I think we're going on IND09, basically. But I'm going to check it, so.
Yeah,
No.
leave your screen.
Sorry. Okay, Charlotta, please begin.
Yeah, I was wondering a bit. Can you hear me through the mic?
Yeah.
So why aren't every newspaper, every media company doing what The Guardian does? I have to say I'm truly impressed by the work that you do. And in fact, the thing about the MP's expensive is fascinating. It's really crowdsourcing investigative journalism in a new way. I've never seen it before. And you surely attracted some good PR in doing this. I mean, probably you could cut spending on your own PR budget.
Yeah, I think we probably could.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, so why aren't other newspapers doing that? I think we're in a luxurious position at The Guardian. So for those of you who don't know, The Guardian's owned by a charitable trust called the Scott Trust. So we don't have shareholders to please, which is real luxury. All we have to do is persuade the trustees that we have the idea that will succeed. And so we don't have to do things that are about short-term revenue tomorrow. We can do things that are a bit longer lasting. I think that's a position of luxury. And I'm glad people love the experiments we're doing. I forgot to say earlier, they're all open sourced. You can actually go and get the code for most of the things that I showed you in terms of the Twitter stuff and the MP's expensive stuff. And they all actually have APIs themselves. So you can actually get an MP's expenses API out of it too.
So I was wondering, what are the hinders for the traditional media? I myself work at Dagens Nyheter, an old media company just like yours, and we haven't come at all as far as you have, I have to say. So what would be the hinders? I was thinking a bit for myself, and one obvious hinder would be the copyright rules. And I'm sure, I mean, that would be. What would a traditional media boss say? Oh, I can't do this because of the copyright rules, but I'm sure that could be dealt with.
Yeah, I mean, we spent about 6 months before we actually switched the API on, and the thing that we spent most time on, apart from development, was actually talking about rights issues. There's 1 million articles in the API, but actually there's probably about another third that we can't share to do with copyright regulations. And what we're doing now is we're just basically saying whenever we sign a deal with a contributor or with anybody else, they assign rights that would allow us to put them in the API and get them remixed. Because it is the biggest problem. The other big legal problem is libel, of course. We've had to sort of take technological steps. It's not quite the right word, but every developer who signs up has an API key. so we know who's getting data. We tell them that they can store the data for up to 24 hours, but they must remove it from persistent storage after that, so they can only cache it. And that they themselves take on the risk of libel if they don't adhere to those terms.
Okay.
So we are dealing with legal takedown in that we're saying, you've got 24 hours to flush your caches. We're encouraging people to get data every 15 minutes. So if we have to take something down, there's a chance that it'll be gone from your site before somebody can say that's libelous. Please remove it from your site. But it's a thorny issue. So libel and rights are actually the trickiest things.
I could imagine. I thought that would be the two main issues.
So the thing is,
if you ask me, it's you can handle these issues just as you showed. And the thing that I was thinking about, the main hinder in my view isn't the rights issue or the libel issue. It's more like losing control. Because we in the media company, we can spend hours and hours debating about the layout on a couple of pages, or spending nights sleepless over a bad picture. And we sort of view the product as a complete product. We are sort of like tailors doing a perfectly fitting suit. And here you come and say that, oh yeah, there are some customers that want to change their suit. And you even say, well, there are some customers that don't want the suit at all. They want the cloth and the thread and the needle because they are making a skirt or a coat. And that's pretty much shocking to a traditional media company in the view.
Yeah, and I mean, it's shocking in a way to The Guardian as well. I mean, The Guardian has a long tradition of design and typography and layout and feature packages, and these things are part of the DNA of the organisation. What I think going forward that all media organisations will be seen as are curators. They're curators of news, they're curators of content. And that I think is what users will come to see media organisations as. And they'll say, well, actually, I really like The Guardian because it has that liberal curation of things. Or I really like The Telegraph because it has a more conservative curation of things. And so I think that's what they'll see people as. And as long as you have some way of seeing where the content comes from, it doesn't matter what cloth it's covered in. The experience on mobile is different from the experience on the newsprint is different from the experience on screen already. And much as we can try and tailor these experiences to have something of that brand, of that sort of the design of the suit, we have to realise that if we're to sort of survive, that people might not want that suit. They might want something different. They might want to mash up Twitter and blog posts and our football coverage and make something totally new. Which might actually, have a higher ad revenue than anything that we could do with all of our bespoke tailoring. And so I think it's sort of there are so many different unknown ways of doing this. It's time to sort of kind of let the users decide how they want their newspaper.
Okay, thank you, Charlotta. We're going to move over to Bo Hedin, or as we call him, Uncle Busse. He's been around forever, and I think all in this room, we all love him.
Thank you very much for that.
Take it away.
That great introduction. My first reaction was, wow, I want to go out and do it. It's really so exciting, and it's so much, so you really have to think about it. I've read something about it before, but I didn't realize it was so much different things you are doing. So I'm really impressed. For the moment, I'm working as a consultant for 3 small newspapers in southern Sweden. Small newspapers, strong market share in small towns in Skåne County. And I'm thinking about the traditional role of a local newspaper. And this really fits in. It's building relationships with readers and advertisers in a way that we so far didn't have the tools to do. So this is really exciting in that way. Interaction with a local community has always been our task and the core in our business and our what we do. So, well, I'm impressed. This is new tools to go on with the old business.
I think local is a really interesting market. I think, you know, the selection pressures that we're seeing as an industry in national or international news is nothing compared to those in local news. There isn't a week that goes by in the UK where we don't hear about a newspaper closing, a local newspaper closing. But I think what we also have at the same time is we have an unprecedented set of, it's like a big box of Lego, of technological Lego that we can stitch together in different ways. And if you think about it, something like Facebook, plus a news stream, plus a whole load of cloud hosting, plus Google AdWords, is essentially a local newspaper. And so I think people just have to try and sort of pull back from the old view that they had of what a local newspaper is and get to the bottom of it, which is actually, it's about those local people. It's exactly what you said. And it's about people connecting. You know, I think you could do some really interesting stuff with Twitter lists, for instance, curating a list of people who live in a small village and who tweet about it. There's actually a Labour MP in the Midlands who's creating a Twitter meetup for his constituents and his constituents only, and he's started curating a list on Twitter. Now that's a local news station, in my opinion. You know, they're all talking about local issues, but they're all surfacing wider issues. So they're probably talking about schools and hospitals and health and things like that, but they're pointing to national news as well. And that strikes me, that's exactly what the original local newspapers were. And it's just done a different way.
You touched the subject of business model and to make revenues of this. And this is, of course, very interesting in these times when every business, every newspaper manager is struggling with these questions. So, could you tell us a little more about how do you do?
Certainly. I mean, well, for starters, it's really, really early days in what we're doing. So it would be really unfair of me to tell you that it's saving the newspaper or anything like that, because it's a long-term play. We do already have some content integrations that are making money, both for us and for the developers, within 6 months. And that's on the ad network model. We also have a few people who've said, we don't really want to take your adverts, but can we syndicate your content? Can we be a syndication partner and do it via the API? And we've said, yeah, of course you can, that's fine. And so we've got revenue coming in that way. And it's small little pockets of revenue that build up.
Because this is very interesting in the local community. The newspaper traditionally has working very closely with the advertisers and with the local shops and businesses. Yeah,
there was some of the people that I met at the Future of Web Apps conference in London were 6 apart, and they've been recently doing some stuff to do with their blogging software, where they've been working with local news organisations, and they've actually got a sort of a typepad module that plugs in, which is to do with coupons for local shops. So you still got lots of these things that you have in community-based or local news that you can do online. You just have to try and sort of take a step back and say, okay, how do we reinvent this? How do we change it? And the pieces are often going to be the same. They'll just be in a different order, almost.
Okay, thank you, Bruce.
Kind of worried about what's going on up there now. I can't read half of it, so that's okay. I don't need to worry.
I like to say, since the setup is less than optimal, if you feel like you don't see anything and you desperately want to see the crowd up here, please rise. I mean, that's okay. You can even stand on your chairs if you like to. So the next guy in the panel is in the borderline of mobile and tabloid, basically, TV4 and Expressen, and he's our very own 3-piece suit Energizer bunny. Maurice Packer.
Oh, thank you for that. Okay, I liked Uncle
Busse.
I'd love to say several things to you, Chris, especially, and I'm impressed in all the nice things you should say. But I have to start on another end, because when I get invited to these things, I always feel like, okay, they needed somebody to represent the dark side. So I'm Darth Vader in this conversation. Big, old, ugly capitalist media. Here we are. Welcome. And somehow along the line, and since this is called From Printing to API, and I followed some of those discussions, which were very interesting, I found a different approach, which I'd like to call Gutenberg's tears. So Gutenberg, he invented the European version of the printing press in the early 15th century. And I think he cried. Because I think he realized that he had invented something that was definitely a total paradigm shift without a clutch. Would totally change things. And people just didn't want to understand. Because what did he do? Okay, so he makes the movable type, he puts it like that, he prints, he shows it, and everybody's going hooray. And instead you had people saying, well, we have to have the illuminated letter in the beginning, the anfang, we would call it in Swedish. So they would have to make special first letters for every page we're going to print, and thereby lowering the production speed of the printing press. And eventually Gutenberg went bankrupt. But I believe that he realized the power of this instrument as he started. Somehow, regardless of what other technology changes happened since Gutenberg, we always have this crowd that are not represented by Uncle Bosse, not even by me in my suit, of the people who are always trying to drag the new opportunity into something conceivable and understandable of the old perspective. I mean, we're looking at a totally different new world, and still people don't want to understand. Now, most of you in this room are right now looking behind to see what's going on in the back channel. That's a totally new dimension, which is very, very interesting, or at least novel and fun. Basically, we have been stuck continuously. When they said that the world was flat, and everybody believed it was flat. Think of being Christopher Columbus before sailing off and realizing that the world is round, and everybody said, no, it's flat. And so he said, it's fine, flat. Then we told everybody it was round, and they said, okay, it's round, but the sun is the center of the universe. And then we had to tell people, no, the sun is not the center, we are all part of a moving object moving around space. We're continuously, all the time, going back. So coming back to The Guardian and into the development they're doing is, here I'm supposed to say spandex, but I can't get that into this somehow. But basically, I'll inform you about this later.
I'm really glad you can't.
It's a long story, Chris. Don't worry about it, it's a long story.
It's not a pretty thought.
Basically, everybody is whining about the survival of newspapers. Everybody's complaining, journalists are unhappy. For God's sake, stop. There has never been so many opportunities. If you look at the thing we did with the British National Party and did a mashup, you could see where all the Nazis were living, so you go and bash their heads, which would be a nice party. It is still that the need to curate or to edit the data to make it understandable has never been more needed. With the unlimited amount of data sources, and now that we're opening up APIs with government data, there's never been more need for doing creative and good work. And you, my fellow visitors here today, it's your fucking responsibility to start being creative and doing astonishingly good stuff. Because if it's old organizations like Guardian, and in my case, TV4 Express, and if we are beginning to open up our data vaults, you have to start to being creative. And that's a desperate thing now. Otherwise, the consumers will leave us, and they will definitely not be interested, and they'll just be watching programs like the things we show on TV4 in Sweden. So basically, there is an opportunity here, and I would like to say that everything that Chris has shown for The Guardian is like proof of concept that we can do different things. Now the question is, are you going to continue complaining about the harsh times or the new values or the difficult situation for newspapers, or are you going to start to be creative and invent? And that's where I'd like to see The Guardian as like carrying the Olympic fire, and all these 4 Olympics we get for the money for the bank saving is showing on for other media that this can be done. And I can say on the Swedish market, as exactly as Charlotte said, we have come nowhere, which is strange because Sweden is a country with a tradition since the early 16th century of collecting census data. We have the longest line of census data. So everybody in this room has to go to your people and say, we want to release the data so we can start building things. And we will see abominations, we will see people building mashups of who I went to bed with or whatever, but we will also see incredible things if we start doing things instead of worrying about the time that has passed. So I think I'll stick off there and let you go into this, but more of it, we need more creativity with the opportunities that are available and less whining.
Thank you. So to bridge that, please give us questions on the back channel and we'll make sure that Chris sees them. But to bridge from what you said, Morris, about stop whining, I mean, what are the reactions inside The Guardian to this? Are they all doing high fives or do you have to do some?
We had to go on a journey, that's for sure. People weren't immediately, yay, fantastic, let's go do it tomorrow. Lots of people are like, oh, it'd be really, really bad if somebody made an app that was all about my content. We had that from a few journalists. I'd be delighted. You know, I'd really be delighted if somebody cared enough about what I wrote that they made an individual app about my writing. I don't necessarily see the problem. Some of the syndication people are really, really confused. They're like, we've got our existing business models to do with how we syndicate content. You've just come along with your fancy new API and you've completely knackered our model that we've had for years. You know, what are you going to do about it? And the answer was, well, actually, you're syndicating the API as well, so our new world is your new world. There wasn't universal delight, but I think you have to go on that journey. And we spent a lot of time in meetings where there was somebody from every department there, and you would discuss it philosophically. It was kind of like the Edward de Bono 6 hats thinking thing without the sort of pretty coloured hats to wear. But it was really interesting learning about the legal issues as well as them learning about the technical issues. And I think you're totally right. Everyone just needs to stop whining. This stuff's here. It's going to happen. And actually, if the American government bails out their newspapers, it's going to happen regardless of that. It's kind of like bailing out failing banks. You know, sometimes dinosaurs need to be allowed to die. And whatever consequences happen to a certain extent. And I think it's sort of, organisations just have to be slightly more focused on sorting their own problems, rather than as an industry complaining and saying, please can we have a handout to fix this? Again, we're in a very privileged position with the Scott Trust. You know, I never sort of fail to be overjoyed at the fact that we don't have banks and insurance companies and pension funds as our shareholders who would see what we're doing and they go, you're giving it away for free? You know, we're not giving it away for free. We're saying, come and monetize it with us. But I'm just really lucky that Mike Bracken never has to go into those conversations with shareholders.
So, Bosse would like to comment on that.
Yeah, I have a question of how did it happen inside the Guardian organization? Where did you find the driving force? Was it top management? Was it you? Was it editorial? Was it advertisement? Was it production? Where did you find the driving force?
It was actually
how did it happen?
Yeah, it was the second to last slide. It was Mike Bracken, our technical director, who said basically, this is what we have to do. He then went and hired Matt McAllister, who was ex-head of Yahoo Developer Network, and said, okay, how do we build a developer network? Matt then hired me to sort of, as a geek in residence, to look at the API from within and without, and sort of say, okay, if I'm an external developer, what do I hate about this? What do I hate about the terms and conditions? From an internal developer, what can I do in terms of making it better, and what can I do in terms of building relationships outwards? So it came from technology. It was, for once, it was like the whole media model sort of flipping a tiny bit. And we're a small microcosm of The Guardian. We can't pretend for a moment that this is all of The Guardian. It's a part of it. But it's a part of it that the more you do, it's kind of like drugs really, the more you do, the more that people want you to do more. If you look at things like we've done on Twitter and done with MP's expenses, we now have editorial people coming up to us and saying, can we have something? Can you build something for us? And so there's the risk of the fact that you have to sort of say, well, hold on, we have other bits of the newspaper to make as well. But it does sort of spread through organisations once it starts happening.
But this is a question, how do we get this happen inside our organisations like or
I think people who are passionate, I think, is the answer.
How do we do it? What is your advice?
The advice is just say, okay, you know, let's stop whining, let's go make it, let's go do it. You know, we won't have something to whine about in a few years' time if we just sit here and whine.
Or maybe you could just start them up with some easy twittering and then they end up like heavy Django junkies or
something like that, yeah. But I think, you know, part of it is experimenting, for instance. The stuff that we're doing with cloud services, with other people's APIs, that's low cost experimenting, but it's quite high profile. You know, you get people like Facebook saying, that's really cool, would you do so-and-so? And you're then in control of that relationship. Or you have Twitter coming to us saying, we really like this stuff you're doing, have some more API limits and things like that. So I think, you know, part of it is this sort of whole culture of don't tell, show. You know, and I think that's got to be part of it. But at the same time, it can't just be a small skunkworks team that sits there outside the organisation. It has to be owned from on high.
You have to have a commitment from the
Yeah, absolutely,
management.
absolutely. I mean, or else it just won't work. I think, you know, if I was to go out to another developer who I respected, and lots of these people are my friends, and say, okay, come and have a play with this. And they'd say, how long is that going to last? Is it a labs project? You know, and that's why you need the top level commitment. Because if somebody's going to go out and make something that is potentially their business, they have to know that it's still going to be there, or at least that you'll make every intention of it being there. And that means it has to be owned by up there. So.
Maurice.
Well, as always, I mean, we're saying very nice things, but I still believe we have to raise the, should we say, the goals. So I would like to make a proposal to the audience, and that is that next year, 2010, is the Swedish election year. And I think that you should all start thinking about building things coming to that election. We are going to make an experiment within the TV unit, the TV4 unit, and that is that we're going to make an API presenting every question we pose in real time on television, which means we're going to do that because we're building iPhone applications and mobile applications to make people to participate in our TV shows. But we will, at the same moment that we present that question in these devices, make it available to whoever who wants to build something. And of course, we will also create a return channel. That way, we should be able to spread that if there's a political debate on television in Sweden, that we could get more participants, which should benefit for everyone. But this is just a small example or a test. What I'd really like to have is, before I leave this room, 20 requests for APIs coming up in the back channel, because this is the time to ask for them.
I think you're going to get it. I'm fairly sure. Chris, one of the questions from the back channel that has been tweeted and retweeted, where do you stand? What's your position on Google? We see a lot of newspapers clamoring up now and trying to stay out of Google. We see the ACAP initiative from WAN and so forth. What's your position?
Our position, well, so interestingly, there are two positions within The Guardian. This is where there are schisms occasionally, and this is me being brutally honest with you as an audience. In England, we had a report called Digital Britain, which the people who are old world content and media owners sort of wrote for the government, if we're honest about it. If you look at it, it's about the fact that there should be universal broadband provision for all up to the amazingly fast amount of 2 megabits per second. Whoa. And the reason why all the content owners say that they want it is so that people can watch iPlayer, which is the BBC's catch-up service. And Guardian News and Media, which is the big parent organisation, waded in on the particular piece of the report saying that the newspaper industry was at threat from news aggregators and people like Google. From within the technical department, the people who see the server logs and who see everything like that, I say actually you need Google, and you need Twitter, and you need Facebook, and you need traffic from wherever it comes. And so I personally don't buy these arguments that you have to hold on to your content. I think the very opposite. I think it's going to be fascinating when people like Murdoch open a paywall, have a paywall. I say open a paywall, that's a bit of an oxymoron. Having a paywall is going to be really interesting when you want social distribution. Because suddenly all these people, maybe one person who's got a subscription will tell their friends about it. And they'll go running into the paywall. And in the UK, they'll divert to people who are still open, like ourselves, and to the BBC, which has a mandate to always be open as a public service broadcaster. So I personally think you need Google for the sort of like the distribution element. And I can't quite understand people who say you don't. It's just the world we live in.
Yeah, I think the paywallers are fairly knowledgeable about that. They need Google as well, so they're working on the easy fix. I mean, three hits are allowed, and then they're going to close down and so forth. But Charlotta.
You mentioned BBC, which is very successful on the web. What's your opinion when it comes to the competition from a public service company like BBC? Does it hit your business because you have to have money on the web?
I think it's, for starters, we all love the BBC. It's a wonderful thing, but you can't ignore that it has a pressure to do with free news. And I think that the pressure actually is in specific parts of the news industry. So for instance, I doubt that The Sun or the Daily Mirror or the tabloids have any sort of pressure from the BBC, because the BBC doesn't tend to run stories about sex scandals of sort of second or third rate actresses, whereas The Sun does. So, you know, they don't see much selective pressure. I think people who are in the broadsheet industry do, and I think it probably clouds a lot of the conversations about what do we do a lot of the time. And I think it comes back to this sort of whole thing about you're part of an ecosystem to a certain extent. We would love the day when the Telegraph has an API and the Times has an API, because the more people that have it, the more people will then make really beautiful, diverse tools for looking at news and for matching up news. And if the BBC is one of those sources, then great. I think it comes back to this idea of organisational voice and curation. You know, when I was a child, the thing that formed my opinion of music was the BBC, and it was one show, John Peel's show. And I loved his curatorial stance on music. And I would listen to that show every night, and I would tape things off of it, you know, in the sort of old school way of doing piracy. And I loved that form of curation. And I think other people will sort of look out for the curators and the voices that they love. And for some people that will be the BBC, and for other people it will be the Guardian, other people it will be the Times. I think they're just sort of different slants on the world almost that you accept are there. And I think to a certain extent maybe we overthink things to do with the BBC. And there was a situation a few years ago where the BBC were doing a lot of stuff to do with educational games for children. They had a site called BBC Jam. And lots of independent education software companies petitioned for it to be closed. And it was closed. And overnight, they actually put out of business a lot of companies who were producing work for it. And so I actually don't think it advanced the online education for kids industry in the UK at all, having it removed. I think it made it weaker. I think you need public service broadcasters because they do the things that actually other people don't necessarily want to do.
Great stuff, Chris. And we're going to open up for questions from the audience as well. So just wave and I'll let you in. We have another question from the back channel. You talk a lot about love, being loved and being in and not on.
Yeah.
So far, what are the reactions from the social media sphere? Do you feel love?
It's really pretty positive. Yeah, we do. We do feel loved. It's a nice job to have. Some people want more. Some people want images. Some people want, you know, all the rich media from our sites. There are always people who say, well, I want this, or I want that, or give me this sort of data, or I'm never going to build on your stuff. You make me take your adverts and things like that. And it's like, well, okay, we're all just trying to get along and make a living here. I'd say that, you know, the only time that we don't feel loved is when, you know, people ask us for things that we would love to give them, but we can't, and they don't quite understand the reasons why. And that comes back to rights a lot of the time.
You do seem to have a very open conversation with the crowd.
We try to, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are obviously things that we have to play close to our chest because we're a business, you know. Businesses always naturally have some sorts of secrets. You know, it's just the way of the world. I wish it wasn't so.
I can discuss that with you later on tonight. I think that's rather an old way of looking at it.
It probably is, yeah.
Yeah. Please. Yeah, can we have the mic over here? There first, second row.
First, I had just a general thought or comment that when you say that there would be an outcry of sorrow if you disappeared, I would actually kind of hope, if I were you, that there wouldn't be, because your users would have built such a shell around and inside you that it wouldn't even be noticed, really, that you've sort of built yourself into extinction in a good way. But what I was wondering is, as a journalist who actually works also for TV4, my experience is that it can take a lot of time for higher-ups to understand the benefits of social media, new ways of doing things. So I was wondering, how, I mean, this is a really simple question, how did it start? Who did you have to kill or buy muffins for or perform dirty deeds upon to get somewhere?
We're a leading liberal newspaper. We don't kill anybody, really. But
Maybe that's one of your secrets. One of the
It could
things
be
you
one of the
don't
secrets.
tell.
How many bodies do we have lying around? Why did we move offices just as this happened? No, it was, I think, because of the way the Guardian's funded, because of the Scott Trust, there's already a slight difference in how things are done. And I think also lots of it was basically helping to unpack the reality for people of what was going on. You know, we're kind of lucky in that, you know, we have all of our high-up editorial people are on Twitter, and they're active on Twitter. So you don't need to persuade them that actually Twitter's quite a good thing. And we're lucky because of that. And we're lucky that we have people who understand the power of bits of social media and who get this stuff. But I'd actually say that that was probably the result of some very smart hiring about 5-10 years ago. And the Guardian's had a website longer than most other UK publishers. You know, they had their first website in '96. So actually, you know, that makes a difference. The fact that it's already part of the organisation, and you know, they've been practicing at this stuff for a long while. But a lot of it was just sitting in meetings. You know, we'd have questions from the legal team of like, well, we need to control where this content goes. And it's like, well, you can't to a certain extent. We can control the first hop, and we can say, if you break our terms and conditions, we can switch off your API key and you shouldn't cache the data for greater than 24 hours. But you can't control the hops after that. And so it's just introducing the legal team to the concept that you just can't do that. And DRM would be bad and would be broken in a heartbeat because it's just plain text. How hard is it to break DRM? And actually we showed them in a few cases. It's the advantage of having some really geeky people at The Guardian. You could sit down and write little experiments for them and say, okay, right, I've just broken the DRM on that particular piece of media. Next try, you know, what do you want to do now? And the other sort of part of that is just getting them to understand what controls we can put in place. And actually, if you write terms and conditions that are nice and friendly, that people break them less. You know, just sort of, I don't know, maybe it's just luck. You know, maybe that's what you can put it down to.
Well, I think
luck and good hiring.
That's a fairly known mechanism on the internet, that if you ask for decent things, you're going to be decently treated.
I think it is.
Yeah.
I think it is.
Just before a second, how about context? I mean, you talk about the legal team, but how did the people, the journalists at Guardian feel about losing the context of their content, or the fear of losing context?
Well, so the interesting thing is, to a certain extent, they had anyway. So the Guardian...
but now you promote it.
No, we promoted it more. So the Guardian website, for those of you who haven't played around with it, is actually remixable in itself. So all the content is put into these big buckets that's controlled by tags. And you can get an RSS feed for each tag really easily. But what you can also do is you can say, I want sport plus music, and it will give you all the things that overlap. So the moment you do that, actually the journalists have completely lost control of the packages that their content comes in anyway. And to a certain extent, the internet decentralizes that too, because there's no concept of a package if you search for a particular term on Google. It doesn't automatically say, well, and this is this article, and these are all the other ones that the journalists would like put around them. And so the internet kind of broke that thing anyway. And what we've done is we've just made it a bit more obvious that we don't mind. And the journalists just have to get used to it at the end of the day. Because, and this is one thing that
that's the key phrase, I think.
Yeah, it
they
is.
Just have to get used
you know,
to
one
it.
of the things that we did quite a lot was showing how easy it is to scrape websites. You know, this is the advantage of having really geeky people in meetings like that, is that, so Simon Willison, who's the guy who built the MP's expenses stuff, said in a meeting that it was now quicker to build working software than it was to have the meeting to describe it. And we used to actually prove this to people in some of these sort of cross-departmental meetings by saying, okay, we're going to build an app now with The Guardian without using the RSS feeds, just by scraping the content and reformatting it. Now, you've lost control already. Wouldn't you rather we had an API that stopped people from having to do that? And I think that's part of it, is just showing them that this notion of control that they have is an utter falsehood. That I can write some code using things like Yahoo query language in seconds that will pull apart the Guardian website and drop it into a database of my choosing. Yeah. And I'd far rather, as a business, be able to give people something where they don't have to do that. Because then you kind of have control over issues like libel. if somebody's scraped the Guardian website, how are they going to know that we've had to take down that story because of libel? If we give them an API and we say, don't cache everything over 15 minutes and come back and you'll get the freshest content, you'll get the new stuff as well. We don't have that worry anymore. It's been my contention about governments opening up data for years. Opening up data is not giving me a scrapable website. It's not giving me an Excel spreadsheet, even one that's controlled by an RSS feed, so I can go back regularly and get it. It's live data. Live data is the key here. It's
Excellent points. One more question from the audience. Go ahead.
I actually have two questions.
Okay.
Number one, we've looked at the great opportunities from the openness. Have you noticed any disadvantages so far? And the second question is, for someone, or if you could give advice to a media company on the verge of actually trying to open up but are still hesitating, what advice would you give to them?
Okay, on the first one about disadvantages, I don't know. I mean, it might be that the syndication team has found it harder to do some deals because people will say, well, actually, I can now participate in the API and I can get stuff with ads embedded and, I can maybe get different terms. So we've maybe made it a harder sell for some traditional bits of the business in the short term. We haven't yet seen any sort of mass rebellions. Nobody's yet built any sites that defame us using our own content, or built mashups that make us look a bit stupid. Though somebody did do a very good app which shows how our swear word usage has changed over the past 20 years. So people do build frivolous things, and you just have to go, oh, that's kind of fun, and then move on. Although we actually did write a blog post about that particular app because we did think it was really quite funny. But that's because swearing's just really quite funny in a way. In terms of the second question about what people could do.
2 minutes, Chris.
I would say hire geeks. Literally hire geeks. Put geeks in positions of power where they can talk to the senior people and do one-on-one meetings with the senior people and a geek, almost like work experience type things. Because their eyes will really, start opening in both directions. We're doing a lot more where we're sitting multi-skilled teams together around the Guardian. And we're doing that because there are so many learnings from different bits of the business that you either want to make the software work better in some places or you want to make the business work better because they now get the internet a bit better. I think, hire geeks is that's not just because I am one and I want to create a job market for it, but I just think that's the way forward. Is some of these things that we take for granted, like scraping websites or breaking DRM or all sorts of stuff like that those of us who are geeky would just go, yeah, that's easy. I can knock something up on the Twitter API in about half an hour that will do that sort of thing. It's like magic. There's a quote from somebody, I can't remember who it was, that said, majority of technology on the web today is almost indistinguishable from magic for a large percentage of the population. And I think it's the same within organisations as outside them. And so I think you just need to actually unfold it a bit and go, it's not magic, it's really quite easy. This is what happens, and this is what other people will do. And there are lots of other people out there that are like me that will do the same.
I think that's an amazing ending of this. I'm sure you could get a lot of applications here for your geek team. You said something about the rapid reaction force. Is that like a standing group that you have waiting in
Not quite. No, I mean it's sort of we're trying to sort of rotate it a bit. We're lucky. We have some incredibly smart developers, and that's partly because we're doing a bit of a hiring program to try and bring together a lot of really good talent. And what we find is if you hire really good developers and you give them general publishing tasks to do, which are really exciting, then they'll sort of coast along at about 60-70% of brain power most of the time, and they'll still produce amazing stuff. And then something like the MP's expenses comes out, and it's like they find extra gears, and they can go and do this stuff really quickly because they're passionate and they enjoy it, and it's for fun, and it's accepted that if you do stuff quickly, it's going to fall over a bit as well. And so it's not a sort of a group of people who sit together all the time, sort of waiting for it to go. There's been lots of cartoons about the fact that newspapers have these infographics designers sitting there with like pictures of trains ready to crash into each other, for the moment that the trains do. We don't have a reaction force like that. It's just sort of that people get really excited by some of these issues and they're like, right, okay, we get a chance to have 450,000 documents which will show that some of the people in power are abusing their power. What can we do?
Right.
Go. And yes, there are late nights involved and
So
grey
matter matters and make it fun for them.
Yeah, totally.
Thank you, Morris, Busse, Charlotta, and Chris, and thank you very much. We're done here. Thank you.